So far in this video, I've been using examples to illustrate the importance of game spaces and how we experience games, with the intention of making it clear that we need to conceptualize the physical makeup of games as a major piece of how these games communicate meaning to players. But there's still one more concept that I think is worth discussing for helping to conceptualize what a game's physical makeup can mean, and that concept is scene. Now, scene is a very vague phrase, so I want to clarify. When I say scene, I mean a specific kind of scene. Stage plays use scene with two definitions. There's the scene in the script sense, as in a specific section of the story, and then there's the scene in the stage sense, as in a specific setting that is arranged physically on the stage for the play. The way I'll be using scene, I mean it in the latter sense, as in the physical makeup of a world in a story's production. Movies don't really have this concept of scene because movies often shoot on several sets and in several locations. There is no the stage in filmmaking because filmmaking isn't confined to a single stage. Plays are confined to a single stage, so they need a phrase for different settings that are conveyed using that same stage, and these settings, with all of the sets and costumes used for it, are referred to as scenes. The difference between plays and movies in this regard is that when trying to convey the space that a story takes place in, plays usually have to have the whole set arranged for a given section of the play at once, simultaneously. This means that actors can jump around from different parts of the set to others, but the set tends to stay mostly unchanged for decent stretches of time, sometimes even for the entire play. Movies, instead, don't usually convey the space that a story takes place in using simultaneity, instead opting for a sequential approach. Establishing shots will help viewers understand where something takes place in the world of the film, and several interior shots can help make sense of where different parts of interiors are in relation to one another to create what films call continuity. Plays have instantaneous continuity because they arrange a set to convey this unique concept of scene. I use scene here as an adjective, because it's not just a format for plays, it's a quality of plays, their ability to convey spatial information simultaneously in a way that other forms of storytelling have to convey sequentially. That said, plays are not the only example of this. The best example, in my opinion, is paintings. Paintings have scene because they convey all of the information of a space in the world of the art simultaneously. There isn't a need to establish continuity because continuity is intrinsic to the medium. The entire painting is just the scene rather than individual shots. Barring more experimental or niche examples, most paintings have just a generalized single space that the entire story and world of the painting takes place in. We see the location, we see all of the people, we see the current actions being taken, and we can take it all in at once, because there is no sequence to the storytelling. It is all simultaneous. It is all the scene. There are movies that occasionally pull this off. My favorite example is The Cook, The Thief, His Wife, and Her Lover. That film is meant to evoke the feeling of a play or a moving painting, featuring wide shots that encompass most or all of a given set at once. And while the film is still in motion, it creates the same sense of scene because it doesn't try to create continuity via several shots, but instead one continuous shot that conveys all of a given space of a scene for the most part at once. And it's a film that, unambiguously, could be described as like a painting. So the question is, do games have scene? And the answer is, well, of course they do. Games are interesting because they're able to contain within a single space both the simultaneity of paintings and stage plays and the sequencing of film. Ignoring cutscenes, which are literally just short films included in a game, the in-game sequencing of games is largely accomplished through scripting. Half-Life is the best example of this. In Half-Life, there are triggers that players have to physically interact with that, when crossed, will activate a scripted sequence. Activating specific events through triggers evokes the same sort of sequential storytelling of film, but masks it through making the player feel like it's happening in real time before their eyes, even though in all actuality, they're causing it to happen by hitting the trigger. This is how Half-Life can feel like a more cinematic experience than games of the time, despite being a game portrayed exclusively from a first-person perspective. It's not that the game uses the camera work of film, but instead it uses the sequencing of events that resembles the storytelling of film, but has the player travel through these sequences to trigger them, so that they always happen at the exact right moment when the player will be there to witness it, making these events compatible with the storytelling language of games. As far as the simultaneity of spatial information that we get in paintings and plays, we see this in games to varying degrees. There are obviously some games that convey the entire space of the game in one shot. Old arcade games like Donkey Kong, Pac-Man, and Pong, and even some newer games like Papers, Please, where the game takes place in one room with one angle on the action. To understand how games have scene, though, we have to adapt the concept to the visual and spatial language of games. Think about it this way. Even though a painting has all aspects of its world conveyed simultaneously, the eyes can't focus on every object at once, and so viewers are required to piece together all of the information themselves. What makes paintings so good at telling small stories is that paintings don't usually have a strict sequence. Unlike film, where the shots used to convey a scene are placed in a specific order, with paintings there is no strict order that viewers are required to follow to piece together the scene of the painting. You don't have to go left to right, top to bottom, center out, or corners in. You can take in what parts of the painting you want, when you want, and in whatever order you want. It's not about the simultaneous viewing of the art, but the simultaneous conveying. And games do have spatial information conveyed simultaneously in a similar manner, even if our viewing access is limited. Let's look at a counterexample to help make sense of things. Super Mario Sunshine. Specifically the level Serena Beach. Serena Beach is a great example of how games can sequence physical continuity in a way that mimics that of film. The level always starts outdoors, outside of Hotel Delfino. When you talk to the hotel manager outside, he lets you in. At this point, the outside area unloads and the interior loads. When you enter the inside, you can't go back outside. There is no reversal of the sequence. This is a gameplay equivalent to an establishing shot being followed by an interior shot. In this case, you actually witnessed the exterior while playing and then were transported to the interior. This is a way in which game spaces are conveyed sequentially, creating continuity through juxtaposition rather than through rendering both spaces simultaneously. Another example of this would be when you go from the Asylum in Dark Souls to Lordran proper. This switch is done via a cutscene, and not through walking from one to the other. It creates a sequence. And most obviously, the traditional level structures of games like the original Super Mario Bros. Showcase an example of sequencing. Super Mario Bros. Implies continuity through the castles at the end of each level, but there is not an actual continuous space that the levels occupy together. Dark Souls is interesting because it also includes the simultaneous form of physical space rendering. In Lordran, you can walk around anywhere and not experience a loading screen. Apart from Anor Londo and the Kiln of the First Flame, all areas in Lordran are accessible to the player in one simultaneous space that the player can traverse roughly at any time. This is an example of scene to me. In other words, scene in games is accomplished when games create a continuous physical space that can be experienced in one go without loading screens, cutscenes, etc. that cause a jump in location. There's a reason I'm even bothering to make this case, which is that the shape that storytelling takes affects how it's interpreted and how it's felt by the audience. The simultaneity of a painting or a stage play allows the creator to tell a story in a unique way, be it frozen in time, frozen in space, broken up into pieces, or told all at once. The story is affected by the way it's told. And we get so used to this idea of environmental storytelling that we ignore the shape of the environment for just what we see from moment to moment with our eyes. We ignore the scene for the sequence. We tend to focus on what changes in the game space rather than the meaning of the space itself. Dark Souls exemplifies this best. The world's interconnectedness forms a web shape that connects more and more towards the center and then flares out into eventually disconnected pieces that form their own little linear ludic arcs. Firelink Shrine is the implied dead center of the game, and then neighboring areas directly connect back to Firelink and often to each other, but then connect to further areas that become disconnected from one another and form a sequence of locations that players will typically experience in a more linear fashion. This web shape is a narrative experience that allows the player to take in the world in a variety of possible orders, all of which will create a different generalized story of the game for each player. If your first playthrough took you deep into the catacombs straight from Firelink, your experience of the world will forever be shaped by that decision in a way that those who went first into the Undead Burg won't experience the same way. But by making all of these places simultaneous rather than a disconnected sequence of levels separated by loading screens, like in the case of its predecessor Demon's Souls, Dark Souls allows for these vastly different experiences to shape the story for each player, such that Dark Souls becomes many stories that spiral out in a similar manner to the world itself. This is why, even though accessible from the very start, many players may never find Ash Lake, a totally optional area that's difficult to get to. The scene of Dark Souls creates an implied arc of gameplay that can be much more varied from player to player, thus making several playthroughs rewarding, not because there's stuff you had to miss, but because there's stuff you never had to miss that was always there, you just didn't look thoroughly enough. This is what makes painting special. How much you can find in one simultaneous piece of physical space being conveyed. Paintings can be approached from any order, but there's still an order that the painting guides most viewers towards, based on composition and the presence or absence of subjects and objects. Viewers can get lost in the scene because it can offer so much to discover, and the same is true of some of the best games. Ash Lake exemplifies this, because Ash Lake is a major piece of environmental storytelling that requires the player to take in more of the world than they're ever required to. Ash Lake is part of the scene of Lordran, but it's one you might easily miss if all you're trying to do is find Waldo, so to speak. Paintings aren't more sophisticated than other mediums, but they do less work to make sense to the audience than other forms of storytelling. Their stories are often more abstract and more emotional, less plot, and more feelings evoked by a moment in space and time. And games have this in spades, but they also have the more concrete notion of plot that we see in novels, films, and TV shows. So our understanding of the meaning of games tends to focus on plot and character and treats environmental storytelling as meant primarily to refer back to plot and character, rather than to see it as its own unique form of storytelling that exists inside of games. It's not just that game spaces convey meaning, but that the scene is shaped by authorial perspective and intent, as well as how players experience this meaning. Going back to Half-Life, the game promotes skepticism of its world through the tram ride, conditioning the player to take note of the world around them with a skeptical eye. The claustrophobic design of the space that funnels you through Black Mesa aids this process by forcing the player to see questionable parts of Black Mesa only one bit at a time. Office Complex seems at first like just a generic office environment, but by the time the player reaches the questionable ethics chapter, they'll begin to see much more obvious examples that something is seriously wrong with Black Mesa, and that this was true well prior to the Resonance Cascade. If the presence of the G-Man isn't enough to spark concern about this, then the player is given more and more overt opportunities. This gradual reveal works well because of how the game space keeps the player on a linear track. This is seen, not just the simultaneous conveying of spatial information, but also the meaning evoked. Because when viewing the scene of a painting, you're not just viewing the space it takes place in, but the meaning, the perspective of the painter, the feelings of the space. And this is why scene is an important concept for games. Games don't just show you a world and tell you things about it, they make you feel things about the world by witnessing and taking part in it. As another example of scene, let's go back to Shadow of the Colossus. When the player gets on aggro and begins riding through the Forbidden Lands, the camera will follow, but instead of placing Wander dead center in frame, it'll instead place Wander and aggro slightly off from center frame, emphasizing the lands more so than Wander and aggro. Wander and aggro are still the subject of the scene, but the framing allows the relationship between Wander and aggro to be given more meaning in relationship to their surroundings. There isn't an explicit commentary. It's just presented as is, like a painting. This is scene. You can pause the frame right here and you're looking at a painting, with meaning through composition and subject-object relationships. Sometimes this feeling is more abstract. Paintings tend to leave a lot of feelings up to the viewer rather than strictly dictating them. A game like The Long Drive does the same. It sets a scene, a vast, unending, open, and mostly empty desert, and your only task is to drive and survive. And within this, the feeling you're meant to feel is left largely to you. Is this vast emptiness scary, fun, comforting, dark, humorous? There is no one answer. It's presented as is. And much like how paintings set a scene, this requires more work on the part of the player to make meaning out of. But meaning is still there. Scene allows players to develop a sense of meaning unique from that of just the story or gameplay, but that can interact with story and gameplay in exciting ways. Ash Lake is not a story beat or a thrilling piece of gameplay. It's the fact that it doesn't force you to experience or even understand it that makes Ash Lake such a compelling piece of the game. It's like walking into a painting. And we'll get back to that thought. It's hard to articulate an idea that refers to something that is itself somewhat abstract. Scene is a malleable concept intentionally because games don't all tell their stories the same way. Scene is less an objective fact of games and more a subjective quality, something that we can notice in games as a part of how they convey meaning. I want it to be subjective because the line for objectively delineating scene from sequencing or continuity like in films is blurrier in games than it is in other mediums. There's never an exact line when it comes to how to conceptualize how art communicates with us. What matters is that too far in any direction can be a problem. Too much focus on having the game convey all of its ideas simultaneously, and the closer it comes to just being a video version of Where's Waldo. Too much focus on sequencing, and we risk generating an incoherent sense of the world that a game takes place in. Games should feel cohesive even when technically using behind-the-scenes trickery to get around limitations that render direct coherence difficult. Scene is part of how we make games make sense. It's how we see the space and recognize meaning in its composition, its form, and how we bear witness to it as subjects, both viewing and participating inside of the frame. This video functions as part 1 to a hopefully ongoing series that will apply the concepts of scene to various video games to look at how games compose game space in a way that generates meaning. In the next video, we'll look at Super Mario 64 and how Super Mario 64 evokes this quality of scene in ways that allows each level to tell interesting individual stories in a manner more abstract than traditional storytelling. Stay tuned. This video is a continuation of ideas explored in previous videos. If you're interested in more content like this, I recommend my videos on Mario Sunshine, Mario 64, Half-Life 2, and Shadow of the Colossus. This video would not be possible without the support of my patrons at Patreon. I have a lot of ambitions for this channel and I want to make more forward-thinking videos about art and culture, and if you like this video and want to support future endeavors, consider joining my Patreon. It gets your name in the credits and gets you early access to rough cuts of longer video essays. Thanks for watching.